Right, we're going. So religious language is pretty short. What we're asking here is religious language meaningful? Which is to ask, are religious statements meaningful? Do they actually express anything about the world? Or at least, what kinds of expressions are they making? What are they actually asserting? Is there actually a man in the sky? Is the Bible literally true? Is it metaphorically true? That's what we're asking when we're asking about religious language. And this falls into the philosophy of language. So we can start asking broader statements about what it means to mean something. What are semantics? How does a word get its meaning? How does a statement get meaning? There are a few answers to this. The first answer is that statements are meaningful by their syntax. So a syntax is basically the grammar of the statement. Is it grammatically correct? So one thing we don't know for start is that if a statement isn't grammatically correct, if it doesn't have a coherent syntax, if it's not put in the right order, it's not meaningful. So the first hurdle that a statement has to overcome to be meaningful is it has to be syntactically valid. Okay? If you just put a load of jumbled up words together and call it a sentence, if it doesn't have proper syntax, if it's not put in the right way, then it's not going to be meaningful. Okay? That's the first thing that we're going to say about what it means to mean something. But then you've also got comprehension. Can you even comprehend what this statement is saying? It could be syntactically correct, but you just can't comprehend what it's actually saying. So that's the second hurdle you need to jump through. Comprehension. Do you actually understand what it's getting at? Then you've got some other more broader ideas of meaning. Maybe analogy. Can something be meaningful by analogy? Think about metaphors. Shakespeare had plenty of metaphors. Her eyes are diamonds. They're not literally diamonds, are they? But what does that mean? You know, it's got a metaphorical meaning. Everyone seems to understand what that means, but you have to make some kind of some inference, some kind of analogous inference. And then what we're going to look at with Wittgenstein is this idea of the meanings of things being how we use them. Think about some of these new words now that you guys seem to be all too familiar with, like skibbity toilet or sigma or whatever it is that you guys use these days, you know. They seem to be meaningful to you. Not to me, of course, because I don't even know what's going on. But you seem to be using them quite coherently. So there you go, meaning by use maybe. But these are things we need to consider when we're talking about religious language. So there is a distinction we need to make between cognitivism and non-cognitivism, just for the purposes of philosophy of language. So cognitivists, which is like a belief system, is that they say religious statements are meaningful because they are truth apt, which is to say that they have a truth value. They can be verified or falsified. So statements or propositions that can't be verified and cannot be falsified are not meaningful. That's the cognitivist. So they think that statements are truth apt. And a cognitivist for religious language would say that religious statements, religious propositions about God and heaven and all the rest of it, are truth apt. They are verifiable or falsifiable. They do express meaningful propositions. Whereas a non-cognitivist believes that these statements are not truth apt. So they don't express propositions that are meaningful in the sense of it being verified or falsified. All right, so it's like they're saying religious statements are more like just imaginary expressions or something like that, not actually meaningful in the sense of it being able to be true or false. So that's a distinction that you need to be able to make in A-level philosophy. One being the cognitivist, that religious statements are truth apt, they do have a truth value. And the others are the non-cognitivists saying that actually no, they don't. They don't have any truth value. They're not going to be verified or falsified statements. Not like a statement that we might see in the sciences. Like, that is a table and it's square and it has this kind of measurement and this kind of constitution. So this goes into what we call Ayer's verification principle. So we need to, I think we might have touched on this before, and it's related to Hume's fork. So if we can remember Hume's fork, Ayer's verification principle is an adjoinder to that, basically. It's sort of just a, it's just a reinterpretation of Hume's fork. So what is going on here is they're saying that propositions are meaningful if they are apt to be either empirically true or analytically true. So for Ayer and for Hume, the idea is that a meaningful statement is only one that you can either observe. Okay, so if I make a statement about someone in this room, it's meaningful because I can observe it to be true or false. If it can't be observed, then it's not meaningful. But if it is definitionally true or analytically true, if it's true in the sense of just the idea itself, for example, all bachelors are unmarried men, right? So that's a statement, bachelors are unmarried men. Is it empirically verifiable? Well, no, I don't have to go out into the world to see whether all the bachelors are unmarried men. It's just true by definition. Same with 2 + 2 = 4. That's an abstract idea, but we're not going to say it's meaningless because it can't be empirically verifiable. You can't empirically verify that 2 + 2 = 4. It's just true by the idea alone, true in the logic of it. So if it doesn't fall into one of these two camps, either it's true in the logic of the idea or the definition of the idea, or if it can't be true by seeing it out there in the world, then they're not meaningful. So that's Ayer's verification principle. So here's a problem with Ayer's verification principle. And we call people who are these verificationists, like Ayer, we call them logical positivists. Okay? So they believe that this is the only way that statements can be meaningful. It's kind of like science and physicalism, that sort of thing. But what if I said something like, there is life on Kepler 22b, planetary system, millions and millions of light years away. We can't know right now, we can't verify at this time or falsify at this time whether this statement is true or false. But is it still meaningful? Well, we want to say, yeah, of course it is. You could make a statement saying there is life on Kepler 22b, and there quite possibly could be. It's a meaningful statement. But can it be verified or falsified? No. Is it empirically true or false? Well, we don't know. Is it analytically true? Well, of course not. But it's apt to be verified or falsified once we have the ability to do so. We don't at this point in time. But it doesn't mean that that's not meaningful. It's still a meaningful statement. So we might take that further and think about it like religious statements. If I said there is a God who was the creator, and Ayer says, well, no, that's not a meaningful statement. It can't be verified or falsified. It's not analytically true. So does that mean it's meaningless? Well, maybe we just can't verify that now. Maybe that's just something now that we can't understand. But we might do at some point, just like the idea of life on Kepler 22b. Of course, you might think that these are comparing pears with apples. Kepler 22b is something physical that we know is out there. We might say that something like a creator God, this transcendent being, is something that's not quite the same thing as Kepler 22b, because we don't even know where that thing would be. We don't even have an indicator of how we might one day verify or falsify God being the creator. So this then comes to Ayer's stronger and weaker versions of the principle. So the strong version of the principle would say that it's the one that we've just talked about. A proposition is meaningful if we can directly verify the statement by observation. So that's the strong version, which wouldn't allow for things like saying that there's life on Kepler 22b. The weaker version states that a statement is meaningful if there are some observations relevant to determining whether it can be truth apt. Now at this point we might say, well, even on the weak version we don't have enough enough evidence, enough observational proof that there is something out there that we could possibly verify at some point. Has a God come down and revealed himself? Well, you know. So that is just to take the two versions, which this would allow, obviously, for statements about Kepler 22b, which we can't verify. So let's have a look at some criticisms, more criticisms of Ayer's verification principle. One is to say that the principle is just too strong. If only statements that are empirically verifiable or definitionally logically true are meaningful, what does that say about all the other things that we like to talk about? What about discussions about paintings and our ideas on, you know, the metaphysics of mind? There's so many, or literature or Shakespeare, like there's so many things that we would want to say are meaningful, so many ways of speaking to each other, so many ways of communicating that we'd like to say are meaningful, which don't fit Ayer's verification principle. It would render much of even academic conversation meaningless, because that's not always strictly empirically verifiable or analytically true. Some ideas just aren't that sort of thing. What about intuitions that we have? What about Descartes' I think, therefore I am? You know, there's some self-evident truths out there, some really strong ideas that don't really fit this principle. So that's the criticism to say it's too strong. Rules out too much of our discourse. The second one, interesting one, is it's actually self-defeating. Is Ayer's verification principle either empirically verifiable or analytically true? No, it's not. So it means that his statement in itself is meaningless. And if its statement in itself is meaningless, then we ought not to believe it. Big problem there for Ayer. Right, so let's have a look at some ideas on how religious language might be verifiable. The first one, we're going to look at Hick's response to Ayer. We're going to say that religious statements can be verified, and we call this eschatological verification. Okay, the afterlife. Eschatological being a study of the afterlife. So this is eschatological verification. It can be verified in the afterlife. So this kind of goes back to that weak principle, the weak version of the principle. If I say there is a God creator, there is a heaven, and you say that's meaningless because we can't actually know. Well, I could just say, no, we can't know that now, but at some point when we die, we will be able to verify the statement. But there are some criticisms of this. Yes, it may be true that it will be verifiable when we go into the afterlife, if there is such a thing. All right. But the first one I'll say, the bottom one here, it can't be falsified though, can it? Because we'll be dead. So let's say there isn't such a thing as an afterlife, a heaven, a God that we're going to go and meet. Well, of course it can be verified if there is such a thing. But if there isn't such a thing, well, we'll just be in the abyss of nothingness. So it's not as if, you know, you could come to me and go, there wasn't actually a God in the end, was there? There wasn't heaven. It's been falsified. Well, no, it couldn't be falsified because we wouldn't be there. So that is perhaps a problem with eschatological verification. That religious statements, perhaps meaningful in the sense that they could be verified if there is an afterlife, but they can't be falsified because if there isn't an afterlife, there is no one there to falsify the statements. And then maybe two other criticisms. So, yeah, all right, you die and you go to this afterlife, this heaven, you meet God. But what if this is a different person? What if when you die, you don't remember who you were back in your earthly being? In which case you wouldn't even remember that you was wanting to verify religious statements. You just wouldn't know. You wouldn't carry those same memories. You wouldn't carry those same ambitions when you go into the afterlife. You might be someone entirely different. And then second is, would you even recognize God? Let's say you were that person, you go into this afterlife, you're like, I'm going to, verify God. Where is he? Would you even recognize this transcendent being that is beyond comprehension in our life? if God is so beyond our comprehension, so great, so magnificent, we can never even comprehend what God's like, how are we going to then verify God when we get there? How are we going to know what God is? Those are some things to think about in terms of Hick's eschatological verification. Right, so now moving on to the university debate. Now this is an interesting one about religious statements. This takes on a bit of a different, different flair. So we're looking at Hare, Mitchell, and Hare's and Mitchell's responses to flu. So flu is going to present the problem. And it's called the parable of the invisible gardener. It comes from John Wisdom's original parable, but it's Flu's parable of the invisible gardener. So imagine you've got a garden, all right? And there's two people there. You've got the believer and the non-believer, okay? So the believer says, oh, look at this garden. It's, it's been perfectly pruned and perfectly kept, all how it's been planted in perfect order and everything's great. Perfectly orderly garden. But then the non-believer looks at the same garden and goes, hang on a second. What about these weeds? What about all this stuff? What about this mess over here and that mess over there? There seems to be actually a bit of disorder here. So where the believer goes, oh, that must mean there's a gardener who's kept this garden and made it so nice. The non-believer would look at the same thing and go, actually, no, it's got this disorder. So if there was a gardener there wouldn't be this disorder. So what the parable is stating, that the believer and the non-believer would see the same garden in a different way. See the aspects of the garden. One, as the believer would say, that's because of God. And the other would say, well, no, these aspects obviously show that there isn't a God. And the parable is to state that's how we seem to see the world. That on the one hand, we're like, oh, well, no, this is just, it's a bit of just messy chaos that's come together by chance. Whereas the other person would go, no, well, that was clearly by design. Now, the parable of the invisible garden, what Flu's getting at here is, let's say the non-believer and the believer are there discussing whether there's a God. The non-believer asks, well, where is this God? Where is this gardener? And says, well, why can't we see the gardener? And then the believer says, well, the garden must be invisible. So they think, okay, how can we detect this gardener? So why can't we touch the garden, the non-believer says. Well, then the gardener says, well, it must be intangible, invisible and intangible. And then the non-believer says, well, why can't we detect the gardener at all? We seem not to be able to detect this gardener in any way, shape or form. And then the believer says, well, the gardener must be completely undetectable. Now, this is what Flu calls death by 1,000 qualifications. What is the difference between an invisible, intangible, and completely undetectable gardener and no gardener at all? It's the same as saying, what's the difference between this invisible, undetectable, intangible God that we just can never get at, and just saying no God at all? And that's what Anthony Flew thinks is the problem with religious believers. The death by 1,000 qualifications. If you're constantly having to qualify what God is in light of the problems, then maybe there just isn't a God at all. So that's the idea from Flew. So there are a few responses. We're going to look at Mitchell and Hare. Mitchell's response to Flew is the partisan or the double agent, right? So it's another way to look at the parable. So just reinterpreting a different parable of the same kind of guys. You've got a partisan, right, who says to you that they are on your side, okay? Let's say you're in war. So they're acting on our behalf. But whilst they're acting on our behalf, they're also pretending, as a double agent, to act for the enemy. And they're pretending to act for the enemy in order to get information for you, who they're saying they're acting on your behalf. This is what happens in the world. It happens with spies, double agents, all right? They pretend to be working against the other person by telling the other person that they're working against the other person, but then also, so you have this problem where each side thinks that person is working for them by pretending to work for the enemy. So for Mitchell, it's the same kind of case with God, because with a double agent, you're only going to know whether they're a double agent at the end of it all. That's when you'll be revealed which side they were working for. But at the time, you've just got to believe that they're working for your side. So Mitchell thinks this is similar to how we should interpret this idea of God. It's kind of like Pascal's wager. It's like, well, maybe we just ought to, in light of there being problems or reasons to be skeptical about God, like you could be skeptical about the double agent, you will only know at the end of it which one was true, whether God was real or God wasn't real. And you've just got to decide. You've just got to put your skepticisms aside or just use best reason, because eventually you will know. A little bit kind of linked to eschatological verification. So that's just kind of like reinterpreting the parable about the gardener. All right? Is there any reason for us to give up and say there isn't a gardener? Well, it's kind of like the double agent thing. Yeah, we've got reasons to be skeptical that there's a gardener. We've also got reasons to maybe think that there is a gardener. So we've got to just ultimately wager one way or the other, and then we'll find out at the end of all things. So that's just another way. That's an argument against a response to flu. Another way to interpret what's going on there. Second one is Hare's response, which we call blicks. So this is a word you're going to need to know, called Hare's blicks. So for Hare, a blick is a way of seeing things. So perhaps religious language isn't necessarily this objective kind of way of seeing, all right? Like the sciences want to say, that there are just objective facts. But religious statements that we make about God or heaven or whatever in various different religions, they all make in different statements. For Hare, this is just a blick. This is just a way of seeing the divine, or a way of seeing the mysticism of life. And for Hare, it's no matter how much you want to tell someone that their belief system is wrong, whether you're a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or a Buddhist or whatever, no matter how much you want to tell them that they are wrong, that is their way of seeing the world. That's their framework. It's their paradigm. So you'll never really be able to untangle that. It's their way of seeing things, their way of interpreting the world. And Hare uses this example of like a lunatic, all right, who believes that everyone's out to get them. It does happen, like people who are schizophrenic, right, psychotic. So you got this lunatic, and everything that someone does that's nice, their interpretation of that is that, oh, it's because they're trying to trick me, because they're out to get me. And every bit of evidence you give them for why actually no, they're not out to get you, they are just nice people. For that lunatic or that schizophrenic person, that's always going to be a way of seeing that as just another ruse, another way of trying to trick them. We see this with conspiracy theorists a lot as well. No matter how much evidence you give them for their conspiracy to not be true, for them that's just like another conspiracy, because that's their way of seeing the world. That's their blick. And for Hare, that's kind of the same with religion. It's just a way of seeing the world. And everyone has them. So Flew replies to this, and Flew states that if Hare's religion really is a blick, involving no cosmological assertions about the nature and activities of a supposed personal creator, then surely he's not a Christian at all. So for Flew, he thinks that's rubbish. All right? Hare's blicks is like non-cognitivism, essentially. He's saying we're not religious people aren't making propositions about the world. They're just seeing the world in a particular way. But then Flew would say, well, what about if you are a Christian? You don't see that as just a way of seeing the world, and everyone has their ways of seeing the world. They think that this is just like objectively true stuff. And if you don't see, the beliefs that you have in Christianity as objectively true, then you're not a Christian at all, is what Flew's saying. So that's the retort there, to say that actually religious statements are trying to be cognitive. They are trying to express factual propositions about the world. They're not just seeing things in a particular non-cognitive way. All right, this is the last slide. So just finally, I want to talk a little bit about Wittgenstein, okay? Wittgenstein was sort of a non-cognitivist on this and thought that the idea of seeing things like Ayer does, all right, by things only being meaningful if they're empirically true or analytically true. He thought that's not the way to see meaning. So Wittgenstein, quite a prominent and in some ways famous philosopher of language, gave us an idea of what it means to mean something. So for Wittgenstein, one of the big ones was that he thought that the meanings of a word is its use in the language. That's where meaning comes from. Meaning isn't these things that Ayer talks about. Meaning is just how we use the language in what he calls language games. And everyone plays their language games. You've played your language games with all skibbity business and, you know, talking about some TikTok-y thing that no one would understand outside of your kind of culture of language game, because you understand what's going on there. For Wittgenstein, religious believers work the same way. They play their own language game within their religion. And they understand what they're talking about. They are conveying meaning to each other because it's meaningful to them because of the way that they're using their language within that space of language users. And that's what Wittgenstein thinks language is. It's us expressing things that have a use in our public domain. Whether you're a tribal person, whether you're from a different culture or you're using different languages, whatever, meaning is essentially how it's used in the public domain. And that's all there is to it. It's not necessarily about these objective truths and it's not matters of fact and stuff. That's its own language game. The verification principle, the scientific language game has its own language game, and so does the religious language game. Although you could argue against Wittgenstein here and say, well, look, if religious language or religious people talking about religion is just them playing their own language game in their own ways of using their language, and it's meaningful in that way, is that the same as saying like someone who believes in Jedi, right? Think about like Star Wars, midichlorians and all that kind of stuff, all right? This is all just fictional stuff. But if there's a bunch of people talking about Jedi, midichlorians and the Force and all this business, are they expressing something meaningful? Well, according to Wittgenstein, yeah, because they're using it in this language game. But is that the same sort of thing as religious language? Well, no, because there's a difference between that being this fictitious thing, which people don't believe is like an essence of reality, and religious language users who are talking about what they believe is an essence of reality. So there needs to be a distinction there, which I think Wittgenstein might struggle making in terms of his language games. Okay, so that's the end of religious language, or just a brief revision video.
May I remember